Hi students, this video is going to take you through the 3 types of rhetorical modes or appeals. So if someone ever asks you to write about or to answer questions about rhetorical modes or rhetorical appeals, they are asking about these 3 terms: ethos, pathos, and logos. So let's look into what each of those terms mean. So ethos appeals to a sense of what is morally right. It connects the speaker to the audience by stressing the values that they share. So ethos is about morality and ethics. And more importantly, it's about how how morally, ethically, or through values, the audience is connected to the speaker or the writer. So therefore, ethos is ultimately about the trust felt between the audience and the speaker or writer. Therefore, you're going to see ethos when you're reading, but you can also use ethos yourself as a writer, and you should use ethos as a writer. So we're going to talk about the 3 ways that you're going to see it, and also the 3 ways that you can use it yourself. So the first way that ethos can occur is by using only credible, reliable sources to build your argument and to cite those sources properly. So when teachers ask you to use in-text citations and to have an MLA or APA formatted works cited page at the end of your essay or at the end of your presentation, it's to help develop ethos. If you do not have credible resources, if you do not have reliable resources, that means that your information cannot be trusted, and therefore you're not going to persuade your readers because they're not going to listen to someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's why you have to show what your sources are, and that you need to make sure those sources are good. Because if your readers don't trust you, then they're not going to trust what you're saying, and you'll lose your audience. Next, you want to make sure to respect the reader by stating the opposing position accurately. So when you're writing arguments, a lot of times you're asked to write the counter argument, to address what your opposition thinks, and to explain what they think, and to then explain why what they think is wrong. So when explaining that counter argument, you want to make sure to do so respectfully. If you talk about the people who oppose you as being stupid, if you say that they're evil, essentially if you use any really harsh terminology towards your opposition, 1, you can make people think that you're a hothead, you can't be trusted, and 2, if people disagree with you and you insult them in your essay, they're never going to be persuaded to think otherwise. They'll stick with their opinion and just think that you're a mean writer, essentially, and you won't be able to convince them to change their mind. So ultimately, by being respectful, you're more likely to cause people to see things in a different way because they feel comfortable listening to you. Last but not least, the 3rd way that we can use ethos is by establishing common ground with your audience. This can often be done by acknowledging values and beliefs shared by those on both sides of the argument. So this could occur along the ways of, oh, you like anime? I really like anime too. We have so much in common. Therefore, you can trust what I'm going to say. So that's essentially what this is talking about here. It doesn't have to do with anime. That's just an example. It could be anything. But by establishing common ground with your audience, showing that you have things in common, your audience is a lot more likely to trust you and therefore listen to you and therefore believe and follow what you're going to say. And that's ethos. So we have these 3 ways that ethos can be developed in a writing: through credibility, through respect, and through common ground. And therefore, if I ask you to analyze ethos in a writing, look for these 3 things in the writer's work. If I ask you to use ethos, then you want to use these 3 things in your own writing. So let's move on to pathos. So pathos appeals to any emotion, including anger, sorrow, joy, and hilarity. So it's important to remember that pathos can be any emotion of the author or any emotion of the reader. It doesn't just have to be sadness, which I think a lot of people default to with pathos. It could be any emotion. It could be happiness. And it's not just talking about the emotion of the writer. It can also be talking about the emotion of the reader. So the author can display pathos, but the author can also play on the emotions of the reader. So oftentimes pathos is the story of the individual. When you're seeing pathos in somebody's writing, they're going to tell you a story about one person who's experienced something. And we then as readers relate to that one person and therefore feel emotionally connected to them because we understand how they feel. That story of the individual is an example of pathos. Now, one thing authors need to be careful of with pathos is to not overdo it, because this can alienate the readers. If during graduation you get up on stage and you're just crying and crying and crying, you can barely get out your speech, people in the audience are going to be a little uncomfortable. Like, oh, is he okay? He's really upset. And therefore your speech isn't going to come off as powerful as it could if you just used a little bit of sadness to remind people that, oh, they're leaving. So therefore don't overdo the pathos. Don't be too angry or don't be too upset. And also don't be too excited. All of these things can make readers feel uncomfortable and it can make them not trust you because you seem erratic. Also, another way to use pathos is by establishing sympathy and understanding, where the readers care about the author and or the author's subject. So by igniting these feelings of sympathy and understanding, a reader is going to have an emotional connection towards what you're trying to convince them of. And when people feel emotional connections towards something, they're much more likely to support it. And if that's ultimately the goal of the writing or the speech, then you can succeed through pathos. Now let's move on to our last term, which is logos. And that one's pretty straightforward. It appeals to logical reasoning. So let's talk about what that actually means. So there are 4 examples of how logos can be seen. So one of them is through an if-then statement. So an example is, if it is 90 degrees outside, then it must be summer. When you see if-then statements, usually there is a logical process being occurred. If this is true, then this must be true. That is logos in action. Now, the one thing to make sure of is that you don't actually have logical fallacies. If Cindy likes dogs, then she must be an outgoing person. Could be a logical fallacy. There are plenty of introverts who like dogs, and therefore you're making a false if-then statement. So when thinking about logical reasoning, make sure not to create or be sucked into logical fallacies, which is false logic. Another example of logical reasoning is if A is true and B is true, then C must be true. This is kind of a more advanced form of if-then. So if the 16-year-old Layla owns a pair of $60 shoes and 17-year-old Gerald owns a $75 pair of shoes, then teenagers must spend a lot of money on shoes. So it's saying if A is true and B is true, then C must be true. Again, when using this reasoning, make sure not to create logical fallacies and make sure not to be tricked by logical fallacies. Just because somebody's using logical reasoning, it doesn't mean they're using it correctly. So make sure to actually think through the logical reasoning and consider whether it's correct or not. Next, we have inductive reasoning. So that's when you start with a smaller example to prove a larger point. This corresponds with deductive reasoning, which is essentially the opposite, where you start with something larger, a larger truth, and use that to prove smaller points. So let's look at examples. For inductive reasoning, if I look out the window and I say, oh, it's sunny out, and people are wearing shorts, and they're playing frisbee, then I can use inductive reasoning to say, it must be a really nice day outside. That's inductive reasoning. You look at small details, and you use that to prove a point. Deductive reasoning is the opposite. So that's when I make a trusted statement so that everyone deserves the ability to of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a common truth that we agree upon. It's a given. I can then use that common agreed upon statement, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, to then make smaller points. So you use an overarching truth and use that to make smaller conclusions using that truth. Okay, so that's logos. One thing I want to point out about logos is that it's not always indicated by numbers. Just because you see a number, just because you see a percentage, it might not be logical reasoning. It could be ethos. It could also be pathos. A lot of times logical reasoning does use data, but don't just assume that because there's a data point, you are seeing logic. Don't get tricked by that. All right, cool. So those are the three terms that you need to know for next week. We have logos, we have pathos, and we have ethos. So get those notes down and come to class ready to use them. Thanks. Bye.